Hello and welcome. Welcome to our special edition of Monthly Report. With us, we have three guests that are professors from Nova SBE: Professor Kátia Batista, Professor Pedro Brinca, and Professor Susana Peralta. In this first part, we are going to discuss the Next Generation EU program. My name is Hugo Marques de Souza, and this is Connected, the podcast of Nova Economics Club.
The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
Is that he were rather the poor were poorer.
This can be the most important step we could take to prevent another recession.
On June the 16th, Portugal was the first country to receive the official green light from the EU Commission to its Recovery and Resilience Plan.
On behalf of the European Commission, your National Recovery and Resilience Plan, obrigada.
Since then, many other European countries have seen their plans approved to invest the money attributed by the Next Generation EU plan. But what is this program? Next Generation EU is the largest stimulus package ever financed in Europe. Let's check the numbers. It will be invested a total of 806.9 billion euros, from where 11.5 are for a more digital Europe, 18.9 for a greener one, and the higher amount, 776.5 for a higher European resilience. From this Recovery and Resilience Facility, 385.8 billion euros are for loans and 338 for grants, that is, without need of repayment. Moreover, the EU plans to spend 1.2 trillion euros through its multi-annual financial framework from 2021 to 2027 in a high range of structural areas to make Europe greener, more digital, and more resilient. Professor Pedro Brinca, I start with you. In April 2020, Ursula von der Leyen said that Europe needed a new Marshall Plan to recover from this COVID-19 crisis. More than a year has passed, and only in June 2021, EU countries started to see their plans approved by the European Commission to invest the money attributed by the Next Generation EU program. However, in the meanwhile, the US economy has been recovering better and faster than in the EU, because millions of Americans have in fact already received the checks promised by Joe Biden in the American Rescue Plan Act, whereas the EU member states have not used a single cent from the Next Generation EU plan. Theoretically, do you think that this program is the best way to tackle the problems caused by the COVID-19 crisis? Or is the EU thinking in the long run and the US only in the short run? Or is in fact the American program better?
Well, thanks a lot for having me, and I want to congratulate you for the initiative, and of course, say hi to my colleagues Susana and Katia. Well, the three topics that you brought to the discussion, each one of them could give like a 10-episode series, right? I mean, it's like trying to solve all world's problems in one small podcast. But focusing on the next gen and on the comparative performance of US versus Europe. Well, first I want to challenge the idea that the US recovery is better. Better is a little bit of a normative kind of standpoint, and we don't know. And one of the reasons why we don't know is that it is true that the US have been recovering faster, but there's also a lot more danger of inflation. Okay, and inflation is an issue because if prices try to start to grow above what the Fed believes is the target, and I guess it's commonly historically known to set around 2%, there might be an intervention raising interest rates, and that can actually backfire and have a strong kind of slowdown effect on the recovery. Now, in the US, the financial markets are already predicting inflation will be above 2.5%. If you compare the rates of return on bonds, on treasury bonds on 10 years versus the same bonds but inflation adjusted, you can calculate the expected value of inflation agents are perceiving, and it's way above 2.5. So yeah, there's the threat of inflation. We'll see if all the extra aid that was done in the US was not kind of overheating the economy, which might put the recovery into question, at least in the medium run. Of course, it's not just about averages, right? So this crisis had a huge impact along the cross-section in terms of heterogeneity, in terms of how it affects some groups versus the others, not just along the income scale, but also lines of gender and race and so forth. So, of course, we have all to put this into balance when you look at the US, but the fact is that in the US, the fiscal stimulus was way, way, way larger than in Europe, okay? It was almost twice as much as the country that had the largest kind of fiscal intervention within Europe, which was Germany, okay? So it's not by chance that when you look at Europe, yes, recovery has been a little bit slower. That would be expected given the rigidity in some labor markets, but also the more modest fiscal stimulus. But the fact is, there's not much of inflation danger in Europe, right? If you think about it, in Europe, most people have mortgages. They buy their own home, except, Germany is one of the outliers in terms that a lot of people rent as opposed to owning homes. But in the general, outlook of all the countries, buying a home is the dominant form of savings, right? And people are tied to contracts where they have to pay all these monthly fees. And if inflation goes up, in an environment where interest rates haven't gone up in the last, 8 years, 9 years, or maybe less, 7 years, people are not used to changes in their mortgage payments, okay? And it's very easy. I was looking at my mortgage payment invoice just out of curiosity. And of course, this scenario is a bit extreme, or is very extreme. But an increase in the interest rate to 7% would almost double my mortgage payment. I don't think, of course, 7 is too much, but still, it's a large increase, just for you guys to have an idea of the vulnerability that we have with respect to hikes in the interest rate right now, especially countries that are highly indebted. And it's not just households, right? You have to think also about governments. Even though most of the public debt now is institutionalized, is bought by central bank and so forth, by the ECB, still, if you don't want to make it completely reliant on institutional borrowing, if you want countries to go back to markets and markets to go back to work, then this is a huge issue. So yeah, so that's one thing. So when you compare US with Europe, you have US, huge fiscal stimulus. People are starting to get really concerned about inflation. Europe, much more modest kind of interventions, but then again, inflation is not so bad. I think that's one dimension. So
can I ask a question without wanting to interrupt you, but we're encouraging.
This is a lot more fun.
In your numbers, how are the automatic stabilizers that we have in Europe that are not available in US playing out? Because when you say that the response in US is like double than in Europe, are you counting things such as protection in employment and other social responses that are automatic in Europe and that are not available in US?
No, but you have to take into account that the US, when I'm talking about the fiscal stimulus, a good part of it was precisely the checks in the mails that.
Precisely. That was my question.
And that's huge. That's huge. Of course, automatic stabilizers in Europe typically are not being taken into account into this math. It's just discretionary spending that is taken into account. So yeah, that can make the numbers closer, I believe. I haven't done the math on that, but still, yeah. So about the whether this is the best way to tackle problems caused by COVID crisis, I don't think it is at all. And why it's not? Well, first, it's well known in the literature or in the policy areas that fiscal policy of the sort that it's being considered has a lag kind of implementation problem, right? So it takes a lot of time for you to approve all these packages and then they come into place. And the issue is that they might come into place when actually the economy is already recovered. So looking at Portugal in particular, they have this, António Rua and then Lourenço, they came up with this daily economic indicator that kind of tries to measure take the pulse at the daily frequency of the economy. And that indicator suggests that the economy in Portugal is not that far away from what it was in 2019, right? So as the economy recovers, of course, if you would assume that the economy would grow at 2%, it would still be 4 point something accumulated over these 2 years that we're still lacking. But the biggest point is the bulk of these investments might come at a time when they're no longer kind of needed as a stimulus, as stabilizing the cycle kind of tool. It doesn't mean that we don't have structural problems in the EU that the next gen can answer to, but as a stabilization tool, I don't think it was the most, it was not the best thing. It's much more important things like Katja was referring, the automatic stabilizers, layoff programs, stuff like that, than it is next gen for stabilizing output. This is more of a structural kind of trying to grab the opportunity. Don't ever let a good crisis go to waste, right? Now I forgot who said that. It's not me. It's a famous quote by someone that I forgot now. But that I think was a little bit the context. Historically, since 2008, there's been a much broader institutional and political openness to a much stronger political activism in terms of economic policies. The kind of stuff that you're seeing now, if it was before 2008, I don't think it would have come to fruition at all. People have perceived the sovereign debt crisis and all the packages after the Great Recession as economic policies that contributed greatly to the bettering of the social conditions and so forth, and therefore created kind of the openness and the forthcomingness, I think that's a word, to have stronger packages, more aggressive if you want. And also there's three things, and just to finish, there's three things about the next gen EU, right? So they have three pillars. One is decarbonization, the second one is reindustrialization, and the other one is digitalization, right? So I'm not going to talk much about digitalization and decarbonization, but I have just two quick things to say about reindustrialization. Well, first, all this disruption in supply chains kind of made gave rise to the feeling that maybe we should kind of reshore our industries, right? You go back to Asia, you bring all these factories back to Europe and create jobs and, be less reliant on global value chains as they can be disrupted by problems like the pandemic. I mean, this is nothing really new because just before the pandemic, you had the Trump administration with all the trade wars with China, with Canada, with Mexico, with Europe and so forth. So in principle, that could be a good thing. I don't think it is. I think it's a big mistake. And I think it's a big mistake because first, all this kind of panic about the disruption of global value chains was grossly overstated, me included. I mean, I and a bunch of economists at the beginning, I'm not sure Susanna was included. Maybe she was. Remember the communication that we did with Fernando Alexandre at the beginning? You were part of it, right?
I was one of the initiators of it. Yes, Pedro.
Yeah,
with Fernando. It started with a phone call between Fernando and myself, actually.
Okay, good. So at that time, we were we were really worried about that, and we kind of even proposed sort of government cabinet to coordinate supply and of essential goods and so forth. And at the end of the day, apart from some toilet paper disruptions, I don't think it was a big thing. And if you look at trade volumes right now, they're already above what they were before the crisis. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, I mean, if you bring these jobs to Europe, you have one of two options. Either you put tariffs, right, to prevent competition from those countries because they have lower labor costs, for sure, or you subsidize production. I don't think either is a good idea because at the end of the day, it's going to cost a lot more money to the consumer. And, it's like the Common Agricultural Policy version 2.0. It stifles productivity, it impedes competition, and therefore kind of leads to stagnation of productivity because you don't have this kind of drive. So I don't think it's going to be very successful in that dimension, but it is what it is. We'll see what comes out of it. And I think I've talked too much already.
No, you don't. Thank you very much for your intervention. Now, I would like to explore another topic that is about. Okay, this is the what we have to invest in Europe, but there's a problem that sometimes in Europe it's really a problem, that is fraud. And the Director General of the European Anti-Fraud Agency said that the EU faces a big risk of abuses in the use of the post-pandemic recovery fund because some countries refuse to sign up to a common transactions database. Professor Susana Peralta, in practice, how likely is this program going to be transparent and efficient? May we observe a misuse of the EU funds as in the past? What do you think?
Yes, Hugo. So first of all, hello. Thanks a lot for having me. Hello, Katia and Pedro. And also, I mean, I'd like to congratulate NEC for this initiative of discussing, you know, current economic issues with our students. I think that's great. Okay, so yeah, I mean, your question is a bit hard because how likely, you know, I cannot really put a number on it. But I can maybe just slightly describe the risks and maybe try to sort of disentangle some confusions that sometimes arise in the public debate about this. What is fraud and what is corruption and what is misuse of these European funds? So, but basically, you know, if you some politicians would say, and some not only politicians, some academics as well, would say that European funds are very heavily scrutinized, and the kind of fraud that we had, say, you know, in the 90s is nowadays impossible, because they have in mind the misuse of the funds, which would be, you know, buying expensive assets, you know, houses or whatever, for the beneficiaries of the fund. It's like I'm a firm owner in Portugal. I get this procurement contract for whatever purpose with European funds. And then instead of using the funds for the purposes that they are meant to be used, I just buy myself, you know, an expensive boat or a nice flat by the seaside. Okay. And indeed, you know, when you look at the number of institutions that have oversight powers over the way that European funds are used, it is very unlikely actually that this kind of misuse would be possible nowadays. Okay. And most of the times you will find in the public debate these people saying that people like me that scream a lot about the danger of misuse of the funds, that we are, you know, that we're not really seeing things the way they are, because indeed, you know, you have like the Portuguese Tribunal de Contas, you have loads of different, you know, reporting periods to the European institutions that would make it impossible for the funds to be used in this way. Okay, and that is by and large true. You know, we're no longer there. Basically, we're no longer in, you know, in the 90s where. Also, you know, we have much better information systems. You have like digital invoicing and all this. I mean, it's very unlikely that you'll find this kind of misuse. Okay. So what we are worried is about the way in which you spend this money, because sometimes just by deciding, you know, spending money to help public or private projects always creates winners. Okay. And in a way, you know, also losers, because the people that get to spend the money, you know, to have to sort of reconvert the technology of their production plant into a greener technology, you know, of course they are beneficiaries of this money. Okay. And the people that don't get that money, then they are not beneficiaries of this money. So where we are worried is that just by choosing the projects, you know, of course, you can be misusing the public money in the sense that there could be potentially projects which would, you know, create more jobs, or which would be more efficient in terms of the green transition, or that could have more potential in terms of the digital transition, where you are allocating the money to this firm or to this sector of activity as opposed to the other, and you are not choosing the one that is more likely to bring more benefits of the benefits that we expect from this next generation EU, which have to do, as with digital and green transition. And there's a lot of public procurement in the story, because there's a huge thing about for instance, investing in the digital equipment for the education system in Portugal, in terms of building up the capacity of the public administration for the digital age, etc. And in public procurement, again, by choosing one provider over the other, again, you can be channeling this money, perhaps not necessarily to the best provider. And that is a form of misuse as well, right? So it's not this obvious form of misuse that we had in the 90s in Portugal, where you had all these people, you had the very famous cases, let's say, of European money being used to buy, expensive cars for the beneficiaries. That's not going to be the case. So I think that the risk that this happens. Yes,
I just
Pedro.
say quickly, I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, there was this saying about Val d'Oise being the region in Europe with the highest number of Ferraris per capita.
Right, exactly.
I don't know how solid is that, but
right, exactly. So yeah, that's a very good example. And, I don't think that the risk that we have anything like that nowadays is very high. Okay, but the other risk of
why do you think that has changed? We are now in a
because there's awareness, because there are more institutions that are scrutinizing. Because the European Union, they also learned about these things. You have this anti-fraud authority and all that. I mean, I really don't think, and again, because those of us who have in some way dealt with the European Union, even as a funder for research, the amount of all the invoices that you have to send for each cent that you spend, it's impossible that you would send an invoice for an expensive Ferrari and you wouldn't get noticed. So that's, again, you still have maybe this kind of like scandalous fraud. For instance, in Hungary, there were a few scandals recently, but it's very unlikely that because that's when it's very easy to spot. And nowadays, the technology of oversight that the European Union and the member states have in place is sufficiently powerful that you just can't get away with things like that.
But do you think, for example, that as we have not the things centralized, we have not a central system that can see everything and every transaction?
I'm going to get to that. So. But I do think that we are at a very high risk of spending the money wrongly in the other sense that I told you about, which is the sense of, not choosing the right firm when you are investing in the private sectors, or not choosing the right provider in terms of public procurement contracts. And there's going to be huge public procurement going on with this resilience and recovery plan, of Portugal and also in the other countries. So for that you need a lot of transparency, basically. And we do have, by the way, a portal of public procurement, which is called the Portal Base in Portugal, which is where, by law, all public procurement contracts have to be there. But if you use the BAS portal, which I do sometimes, it's not a very useful tool. Although all the contracts are there, you have to go and, find contract by contract, just by for instance, you search a provider or you search, a given public institution. For instance, you write to Universidade Nova de Lisboa and you will find all the suppliers of the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in a given time period. But then you have to, download each of the PDF contracts. You will have some basic information there, such as the amount of the contract and the firm who was awarded, to whom the contract was awarded. But you don't have something, for instance, which is very important in this things, which is the ultimate beneficiary, because the name of a firm doesn't tell you anything about who's benefiting from the money, because it's
That's
very
right.
easy to have, many people have different interests in different firms, and that's totally fine. But what I do want is to know how are all these firms connected in a way that maybe you would have, a given public institution that has procurement contracts with 100 different firms, but at the end of the day, 50 of those firms, are owned by a large majority by a single, individual or investment fund or whatever. But at the end, despite the fact that you have 100 different suppliers, maybe when you look at it, there's one individual or investment fund or whatever who is the ultimate beneficiary of like 1/2 or 3/3 of the money, or 2/3 of the money. Sorry, okay. So that's the kind of thing that we are looking at, and the BAS portal doesn't do that, because you would need to have a portal where you can, with very simple queries, do things such as how much money from public procurements in the education sector, or from the Portuguese Environmental Agency, whatever, right? And by the way, all the examples I'm giving are purely anecdotal. Okay, I'm not just, I'm thinking about queries that you might want to look at, and you say, okay, how many millions went not into this firm, but into this ultimate beneficiary from this sector or from this institution in a given period? That's the kind of thing that you want to look at, because then you start having, more transparency, and then where the money is really flowing into, it becomes obvious. Okay. And for that, again, this BAS portal doesn't do that job at all for you. So that's impossible to run any query whatsoever, besides just writing down the name of the contractor, and then, sort of having a list of the contracts in the last whatever number of years. But the Portuguese government did create a new transparency portal, which, with the aim of having a better scrutiny over the use of these resilience and recovery plan funds. And let's wait and see. Okay, let's wait and see. So to be honest, I'm moderately optimistic, in the sense that at least they want to do something different, so that in a way is recognizing that what they have is not enough. But will it be enough? I don't know. We just had very bad news this weekend. We just learned that the person who would be in charge of the Banco de Fomento, who is going to be in charge of capitalizing our firms, and one thing that our firms do need is to be capitalized. We just learned that this person might have been involved in mismanagement of the bank, borrowing money to this president of Benfica, apologies, Pedro, who is now in prison. Okay. So, okay, now he's no longer in prison. He's like, whatever, home arrest, whatever. But, we're not, it's like we still, I think another thing, and I'm going to finish now, but, one thing is, okay, have these portals, try to have as much scrutiny, as much transparency, making all these links, whatever, until we find the ultimate beneficiaries, to make sure that this money is not all flowing into the hands of, 10 big companies, whatever. And then secondly, we should be way more open in the way we recruit people for these key jobs. How did they choose this? And maybe this person is innocent. I have no idea. Okay. But again, these are all bad signs, and we should definitely have way more open recruitment strategies for these key posts that are going to be in charge of oversighting all this money. Okay, because one thing is for sure, it's a lot of money. Okay, what Pedro just said, in terms of the percentage of the GDP, is like 6-7% of the GDP over 3-4 years, is of course nothing compared to the stimulus package that was implemented, for instance, in the United States by both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But it's still a sizable, considerable amount of money. And when you have all this money flowing into an economy, it's hard to apply for these funds. Okay, we have like lots of paperwork, lots of conditions that you have to comply with in order to be eligible for these funds, and so on. So it's only natural to imagine that there are parts of the economy that became specialized into being able to actually grab this money. Okay. So that's a natural thing. So when you have these windfalls, it's like it's like human nature will have it in this way, in the way that some people will get specialized into grabbing this money, and you just have to and we really have to be, and as a society, it's our duty to to really keep an eye on these people to make sure that they are doing it for the social good and not just for, whatever, diverting money into non-productive sectors, the ones that are not going to give the highest yield that is possible under the circumstances.
Can I just say something?
Yes, of course, Professor.
I totally agree with Susanna. I think that's not really where the ball is, to continue using the football references. I think the big issue is that whenever there are these windfalls, and there will be income effects that stem from, increases in investment and so forth. And typically what happens, and this is not something new, this is what happened in Portugal in the 90s, and that led, I think it contributed a good deal to the stagnation in Portugal's productivity growth that we observed in the 2000s. When all these windfalls come and people have these income effects and they start spending more, typically Portugal is a small open economy. The kind of prices that are going to rise as a consequence of this increase in demand are going to be local prices, right? Because prices of goods that are set in the international markets, it's not a small country like Portugal that will be able to affect those international set prices. So it's going to be local prices. And what kind of local prices are we talking about? Essentially non-tradables. Okay, we're talking about restaurants, we're talking about hairdressers, we talk about, and the thing is, as prices rise in those sectors, also it raises the perspective of increased profitability, because prices go up, and you kind of see, and this was what happened in the 90s, you kind of see a diversion of resources, human and infrastructure, into those kind of projects. Now, why is that an issue? Well, that's an issue because typically by construction, these are sectors that are protected from international competition. Okay, I mean, we've spent the whole 2000s and 2010s talking about the curse of the non-tradables. It's kind of already kind of annoying to keep referring the same thing. But, those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it in the future. So one of the huge dangers is precisely that you kind of create the incentives to kind of divert resources to parts of the economy that are protected from international competition through this effect, right, of increased demand and increase in prices in the non-tradable sector. And as such, then lagging in productivity and growth. This is not something that happens just in Portugal. It happened in Portugal and all the periphery economies of Southern Europe during the 90s and 2000s, like a huge kind of slowdown on the convergence process. So I completely agree with Susanna. I think here is much more important a strategic view in terms of what kind of incentives these funds will bring, and the economic consequences of building, this new infrastructure based on aid. And we know that aid kind of, it's addictive, right? You kind of build an economic structure around the concept of aid, and then aid is gone, and now what, right? So if this, what Susanna said is absolutely key. If these structural funds are not used to build resilience and capacity to be competitive, disaster will unfold. I mean, you will divert resources from sectors that are typically kind of, pressured to be competitive and efficient to sectors that do not have that competitive pressure, and as a consequence, the economy kind of lags behind.
Let me add a positive perspective here, okay, about the good things that can happen, because, I mean, I agree with both Susanna and Pedro, many of the things they are saying. I guess a positive way of thinking about these youth funding is that if it is channeled to improve our infrastructure, and infrastructure is no longer the highways, but it is, I mean, this stuff about digitalization, research and innovation, environmental transition, this can be thought as infrastructure that makes our firms more productive, able to attract better talent, international talent, and actually be a good thing. Now, the thing is about implementation, and that's where Susanna was speaking, and it's key. I mean, one of the last things she was saying that I think is really important is that our firms in Portugal are typically small, at most medium size, and they do not have the structure to be able to apply for this funding, to get this funding. But these are the firms that really, and this is, I think, the key challenge. There was a recent study, I mean, you were talking about Fernando Alexandre. I mean, there was a recent study that showed that, I mean, previous European funding was not able to target these firms that are small, that are exporting, and make it in a productive way. So I think this is the challenge, to actually transform this youth funding into something positive that can create dynamics in the Portuguese economy. So just a brief comment before we move on.
Yes, and I would like to ask you too, if you think that the fact that the use of the funds were chosen by the countries, by each country, or do you think that it should be a central decision? If a central decision would be better in Europe, or if this decentralized way of choosing where to invest was the best way or not? What do you think?
Okay, and I did not even congratulate you, Nick, for the podcast and my colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here, so let me do that before answering your question. I think it makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense to, at least theoretically, okay, let's discuss the details, to leave the decision of how to spend this money with the individual countries that show the best opportunities and challenges in their economy. So the principle, at least theoretically, I think it's a good one. And I don't think it's a problem for EU cohesion or anything like that. Now, the issue here, I mean, very related to what Susanna was saying, is that there are some countries, okay, particularly the poorest countries in the European Union, that have a tradition of weaker political institutions and governance. Okay, and this can indeed be a problem if there is no way to ensure that EU funding will be spent where it is most needed. So I think this is the big challenge. And Susanna already said a lot about this. So I would not know all the details, and I don't want to repeat. But let me bring a new perspective here, which is we should be measuring the impact of this funding, and this is not done. I mean, not in Portugal, not. And this, I think, is a terrible handicap. We don't know how this money is being used. We don't know what's the impact it has. I'm going to give an example. So as we'll mention next, I just came from this workshop where disseminated the result of a project, a European project with 1 million euros of funding, where we actually evaluated policies. We evaluated the policies in an experimental way with evidence as rigorous as possible to really show what's the impact of policies funded by European money. Now, when we were in Brussels, okay, to see what were, I mean, we were presenting the different projects, ours was the only project that was being evaluated experimentally, okay? And this is in Brussels with countries that were awarded this funding. In many countries, it was not only, in fact, I mean, Portugal only had one, and typically it is not these poorest southern countries that get the European funding, but no one is evaluating its impact. So I think this is, in a way, we can kind of learn from what is happening now in the world, in poorest countries, which is international donors have pushed for this to happen. I mean, related a bit to what Pedro was saying before, I mean, there is a tradition that international aid is misspent. And I mean, institutions have responded to this. I mean, of course, saying that the European Union, we are also responding and creating better systems for monitoring how the money is spent. But these international donors currently, they actually require that there is some level of rigorous impact evaluation. This is something that we should in Europe and in our country specifically. So this is something that I think would complement very well the transparency that we need transparency, and we need other mechanisms to control the use, to avoid misuse and fraud in these. We need to make sure that small firms, which are the firms that make the productive system in Portugal, ways to apply for these, maybe have some kind of simpler calls or ways of getting grants when you are asking for smaller grants, for example. And we should be measuring the impact of this funding, okay? So the funding will not be spent all at once. So we could have here a way, for example, of doing these at first, kind of piloting some initiatives and then adapting these initiatives, the funding where, or the policies that are being funded by this European money, to adapt and become more adequate, more effective, and indeed to have a positive impact. And so I think that's pretty much what I had to say now.
Just one comment on that. So there are some papers in the literature that look at this impact of funds, right? And how it promotes employment and growth. And, you know, the evidence is not overwhelmingly positive, as you would expect or think. You know, there are very mixed results. And one of the reasons I know this is because I actually have one of these projects that I'm currently performing, which has to do precisely with the impact of the structural funds in the different regions in Portugal. I agree with Katia, there's a lot to go around that, and for more than one reason. I mean, for many years, the European Union kind of thought that the European idea would sell by itself, and that became painfully kind of obviously wrong, so especially as Europe kind of enlarged and became more diverse, which is, of course, I mean, good, and it's part of our identity, especially in Portugal, but, you know, also brings challenges in terms of being able to build this common European identity, right? So we had a lot of programs that promoted people moving around, and this kind of, you know, kind of launches the next topic, right? But they were not enough, right? I mean, we're not as mobile in Europe as people are in the US, right? And we're always kind of with this identity crisis where we're kind of halfway between building a federal kind of idea of a Europe, and on the other hand, you know, more of a community of free trade and of independent states. And this kind of schizophrenic institutionalism doesn't help. But this just to say that, yeah, so European Union is starting to create these projects. I'm doing one, as I said, and a key thing about it is not just measuring this impact, but they are so optimistic that these funds have a positive impact that most of the contract is about making those results public, and because they believe they want to kind of promote, you know, European institutions to citizens. But they haven't asked the question, what if the results are not that positive? So it's going to be a fun project.
And
so,
let me just
so
a bit
yeah.
related to that. I mean, the idea is that if we want to do this experimental impact evaluation, we should do it not only afterwards, which is also important, but we should do it as the funding is being disbursed. Of course, it's not complete and we'll have to do it afterwards, but it is important to pilot and experiment, or really, I mean, injecting all the money at once, and then, yeah, after measuring and seeing it was not really effective. We could have done this slight change in the policy to make it.
Two quick things on that very quickly. So who does that in Portugal, right? I mean, who can do it? So there's been huge improvements in the last, what, 10, 12 years in terms of how the government looks at these things. So I remember Professora Maria Manuela Leitão Marques, when she started the Unidade Coordenadora de Moderação Administrativa, I mean, it really, and brought Simplex and so forth. Since then, she and her team made an amazing work, and all these things that Katia is mentioning, she actually brought this to practice.
Pedro, come on, it's very, very limited. No, don't. She tried, but
Susanna, here's the thing: when you grow from zero, the growth rate is huge, and that's my point.
Yeah, but show me.
One more positive comment. I think we at Nova, can I guys? I think we at Nova are doing a lot more experimental evaluations. Okay, so of course I'm doing it, not only in Portugal, but for example, Susanna is doing it. I mean, and there is a bunch of us researchers at Nova SP that are doing exactly this type of project. So yes, I think it is.
Yeah, but
the capacity, and we are attracting talent to do it as well.
But I think that we cannot. That many of the things that are going to be part of this next generation EU are not possible to evaluate with experimental. I mean, not everything is possible to evaluate. Like if you are building big infrastructure, you can't do it, right? Mm-hmm. So it really depends on the nature of the project. Of course, if you want to help, firms innovation, green transition, and all that, yes, of course, when like your unit of treatment, is like a firm, then yes, you can do it. But or trying different approaches, for instance, in the education system, like which schools are more suitable for this technological transition, whatever. That, yeah, I can imagine some sort of experiments going on, but not for everything. And again, to being just a little bit positive, the European Union is doing, as Pedro is saying, and Pedro is involved, as actually the European Union, they don't do a lot or at all experimental evaluations. But this Joint Research Center, for instance, in Seville, they do a lot of policy evaluation with computable general equilibrium, which of course is not the type. It's not the type of policy evaluation that I appreciate, but at least, there's some progress in that domain. But I totally agree with you that some parts of these at least, in terms of digital and green transition, and also like everything that has to do with the skills, with the upskilling of the population as well, in terms of digital skills, all that we could do way better in terms of testing. That I agree. Yeah.
It's also good to remember that European regulations kind of forces, the government, Portuguese government, that any measure that has like a budget impact, they need to send to Brussels kind of an impact evaluation kind of assessment, and it's not just ex post. It has like to involve the whole cycle of the policy, right? So there's a unit in the Ministry of Finance who has been charged to do that, and one of the things that they've been doing is, the European Union has been funding training for these people to do that. An ex ante evaluation with the methods that Suzanne was referring, with kind of structural approach, but when they designed that, the goal, and this is what's being done at the moment, the goal, and let's see how successful, maybe now I'm the one being naive, but the goal is that when they design these kind of interventions and policies, at least for the largest ones, some are so small as to close some canteen from a police headquarters in Santarém or something, but, projects above a certain threshold, that even the design of the implementation can be done such that, yes, we kind of have some forecasts of the impact that this might have in the budget and in the Portuguese economy along different dimensions with structural models. But then, on the onset, doing it in a way that allows for the kind of ex post evaluation that Katia was saying. Because one of the problems,
but the capacity to generate information to do all that is also very, very limited in this country. Yeah. So that's another problem.
Rather than just throwing us money to train people, I agree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we really have a problem, and that's actually part, by the way, of the recovery and resilience plan. Let's hope that it's decently implemented. Is to actually give the capacity to the public administration to be able to generate and treat the information that you need in order to do all these evaluations. Because I mean, currently, like the information systems are poor, the communication across, like the communication, for instance, between the other ministries and the Ministry of Finance, for them to have the information that they would need in order to do these impact assessments is let's say, let's call it limited, to be positive. So we have a long way to go in that direction. And again, that's one of the things that is embedded in the PR, in the resilience and recovery plan, RRP. Let's hope it works.
They didn't involve money. They involve kind of cultural kind of, I don't know, proceduramental, whatever. I mean, I'm in this project with the Ministry of Finance. For them to achieve their goals, they need some data from the Ministry of Employment. We've been sitting on that data for over a year, waiting for them to send it. And if eventually they will send it, it's going to be completely outdated because it's COVID related. I mean, I remember when there was this specialist audience in the Parliament, I created a little kind of, example of, because Portugal has amongst the best administrative data sets in the world. But of course, they're available
for firms.
Very
poor for families.
Sure. I'm thinking now on the Quadros do Pessoal and the firm side, because one of the things that I did at the time was to replicate something that was done for the US. So I'm not the creative mindset behind it. I just implemented it, which is you have a database in Portugal where for each firm and its establishment what kind of occupations people are performing, okay? And then you have surveys that characterize each occupation by the type of tasks. And the tasks involve physical proximity, physical contact, these kind of things. So one of the things I did was to create by region, because that's as disaggregated data that as researchers we have available, and only until 2018, we're now in 2021, to create kind of a measure of the likelihood of infection based on these questions, right? How much of your tasks every day involve physical contact, physical proximity, and so forth. The government, in theory, with the data that they have, I cannot have access to it as a researcher, but they do. They could even go to the establishment level, right? Now we're devising policies that go at the county level with that matrix.
At the municipality level.
Oh, I thought, sorry.
That's where they are going now, right? It's with municipalities,
Yeah.
not at the county
But
level.
my point is that, there's so much we could be doing more. And if we had, much faster access to this data, you have a whole community of people who
Yeah,
are scientists who've been writing papers on COVID. Okay, so people are interested. These are people that are paid with taxpayers' money. And you would ask, what's the better use for all these people that are being paid with taxpayers' money in a catastrophic crisis of epic proportions, right? You could have all this brain power producing insights, producing research, producing, suggestions for policy, informing policy, making evidence-based policy in real time a thing. But no, it can't happen for, and this has nothing to do with money. Come on, I mean, it has to do with, other type of institutional constraints. And
Sometimes it's also the law, by the way. I mean, the law in
that's
terms
part of the
of privacy. Yeah, it's part of the institution, but it's a tricky thing.
We reached now the end of the first part of this episode, and I invite you to listen to the second part where we are going to discuss the new European migrant crisis. See you soon and stay connected.